All right, since we're at time, I'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to this workshop for assigned or allocated to the Cambridge Disinformation Summit. I'm Alan Jaggelinzer. I'm the head of the accounting group at the University of Cambridge, and I want to welcome you to the session called Journalism and Democratic Backsliding. I've introduced myself. I'm joined with co-moderator Charlotte Esler, who just finished our MBA program at Cambridge and who previously was in the Masters of Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School. The purpose of the summit, which we convened in July, and we're continuing to do work with, for example, this seminar, is to convene global interdisciplinary thought leaders to collaborate on projects that can advance research, policy, and practice to help us better understand the nature of and also mitigate the societal harms from disinformation. As I noted in my opening talk to the July meetings, if anybody's interested, there's a little link code on the right. I view sort of a framework that applies in many, many settings, including in our field, it's fraud and greenwashing, but it could also deal with the rise of authoritarianism, outgroups, marginalizing outgroups. It could be in all kinds of settings where we have 6 particular elements of a disinformation campaign. We start with a malign actor or malign actors who have some sort of incentives. They can be social, psychological, they could be physical, they could be financial, they could be power incentives, or any of the above, to craft or generate intentionally misleading narratives through targeted dissemination channels to a selected vulnerable audience for exploitation. And the reason why I like this framework is because it allows us to think through where are we looking at when we're examining this scenario, and also where are the potential interventions. My field of accounting tends to look at incentives and misleading narratives. That's where we end up trying to go with some of our governance infrastructure and reporting rules. And other fields are looking at things such as the vulnerable audience and how one can help them understand that they're being taken advantage of. Tonight, I actually think we're dealing with potentially 3 of these, where we're discussing malign actors, intentionally misleading narratives, and targeted dissemination channels, particularly in the journalism space. I'm honored to host Jay Rosen, an associate professor of journalism at NYU and the director of Studio 20, which offers graduate studies in digital innovation and adapting journalism to the web. I found Jay many years ago because of his work in criticizing political coverage and the role in erosion of democracy. And he's got some literature there that I recommend everybody take a look at. Richard Sambrook, who supported the summit with a session on journalistic integrity. We have some video content on our YouTube channel from that session. He's emeritus at the School of Journalism at Cardiff University. He was also previously the director of global news at the BBC, where he worked for 30 years as a journalist, producer, editor, and manager. And he's also served as a visiting fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. And as if he hasn't done enough, he co-chairs the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And Ayala Panievsky is a Cambridge Gates scholar who I've learned is almost finished with her PhD. And she's in the sociology department at Cambridge. And I found her because of her research, which explores the ever-changing relationship between media and politics in contemporary democracies. And some of her papers are cited in here. And so I'm excited to host them. And I appreciate their time. And I'm going to talk about the format very briefly and then hand over to Charlotte, who will start our discussions. We're going to have a casual discussion, and Charlotte and I will open with some foundational questions. And then we ask that you please share your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to facilitate them into the panel as we go through. And we estimate an hour, maybe a little bit over an hour if there's energy and some remaining questions. So with that, I'm going to ask Charlotte to kick off with some questions.
Great. Thank you, Alan. So we'll start with a question to all our panelists today. We've seen that trust in media and trust in government have both simultaneously declined across multiple democracies. One example of this was a survey from PR firm Edelman last year. that suggested that nearly 7 in 10 people believe that journalists exaggerate or deliberately mislead the public. We also had a research report from the Bennett Institute of Public Policy at University of Cambridge that found that dissatisfaction with democracy has reached an all-time high in many developed democracies. Why do you think public trust is so low in both of these institutions, the media and democracy? And what share of the blame, if any, is attributable to the journalistic profession? And perhaps, Jay, you can kick us off.
Well, part of the reason is spectacular failures of various kinds over the years, such as the Iraq War and the run-up to that conflict, where the entire justification for the United States entering the war in Iraq, as everybody will remember, was built on a false story that our journalists weren't able to uncover. And there are similar failures involving other events, like giant financial crises that have sort of sprung upon publics without much defense or notice. So part of it is failures of journalism, and another part of it is the confusion between real journalism and media, and people's frustration with the media. That construction, the media, is basically reduced to everything I hate about news and information is summarized under the term the media. And that has given rise to a form of politics in which destroying the media releases a lot of energy. So I have a term for this, which is verification in reverse. Verification is basic art and science in journalism. It's central to how journalists do their work. It's asking, did that really happen? Is that really true? How do we know this? What is the evidence? Where is the proof? Verification is like the central task in serious journalism. Verification in reverse is when you take something that's already been nailed down and introduce doubt about it. And the doubt creates energy and commotion and conflict and rage and emotion. And with that energy released by denial of a verified fact, you can power a political movement. You can give rise to a candidacy. You can win the debate. And this pattern, verification in reverse, is transparent, but it's also very difficult to counter. And it's not clear how our journalists can even react to that. And so those are some of the factors involved. Spectacular failures, confusion with the media and journalism, and then these new forms of politics that profit when trust in news providers is attacked.
Thank you, Jay. Ayala, why don't you go next?
Yeah, so I think these are great points. Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. I think there are a few things that are important to remember. The first is, as Jay says, talking about the media is very different than talking about journalism. And we actually know from research on history how Richard Nixon in the US, as a president, was making intentional efforts to divert the conversation from talking about the press, which was then how people talked about the media. Yeah, 70s, it was mostly newspapers, to the media, because he believed, and this was a very wise move retrospectively, that the media is less connected in people's mind to ideals like freedom of the press and democracy. The media sounds like this entertainment industry that is easier to portray as cynical and evil even. So we know there were particular efforts on the right in the US to change the terminology. And this shows you how important this terminology is. And I think that we should also be very careful about our terminology. And when we talk, for instance, about media trust or trust in the media, we should think what it actually means. Does it mean that people do not trust Fox News or GB News, because that would be a great like step forward, right? But not because they are on the right, but because they spread disinformation and hate speech. So we need to think that we need to realize that inside this huge universe of media or news media, there are journalistic enterprises and there are anti-journalistic enterprises that actually should not benefit from everything that we grant to news outlets, all the protections that we give, the free speech, the freedom of the press. They are manipulating us to think that, for instance, trying to minimize the impact of Fox News is censorship because it goes against a news outlet. But if this news outlet is not operating for the benefit of the people, then it shouldn't be protected by the laws that we put there so that we get more informed and more coherent view of the world and news about current affairs. So I think we need to be more cautious about who we want to trust. I wouldn't want people to trust anyone in the media now, right? So trust in the media is a very big term. It is concerning. I would say that another way to think about media trust is that we don't see trust in news organizations that are credible or that are trustworthy. And we also see a phenomenon that is perhaps even more concerning, or at least as concerning, which is pure hate against journalists. And the reason it matters is not because journalists are that special, and I wouldn't say there aren't journalists that I hate personally, but hate towards journalists leads to phenomena that we see now in many countries around the world, like online harassment, violence against journalists. We see many trends that are possible because of the online communication, the digital age we live in. We see doxing, we see cyberbullying, we see things that are not just very taxing for journalists' mental health and daily work and all this stuff, but also and death threats that could lead to even worse ramifications. But we also see an impact on the reporting, and therefore it changes our information environment as well. And we see a lot of journalists worldwide reporting that they practice self-censorship themselves due to these attacks, these brutal attacks that are orchestrated from above. Oftentimes, these are not these bottom-up efforts, but rather a top-bottom-up efforts by politicians, by political movements, by parties, by different organizations to bash the media and to bend journalists to provide a more favorable coverage of certain issues or certain figures. So I think we should also be concerned about hate and not just trust as we used to in the past.
Thank you. Finally, Richard.
Yes, thank you. I mean, obviously, I agree with Jay and Ayala, but I think both politics and journalists have something in common in terms of responsibility for this fall in trust, which is that I think they lost touch with many communities and many of their kind of demographics. I think that loss of trust is partly due to various groups and communities feeling underrepresented, feeling ignored, and feeling powerless to try to do anything about it. So politics and media seem to operate in separate elites is now, of course, the fashionable word, bubbles. And I think there's some responsibility on both news organizations as well as politicians to really try to understand communities better. That was certainly, I think, true in the UK in the run-up to the Brexit vote, which took many people by surprise here. And it's led to the rise of populist politics in many countries, which has also worked alongside kind of autocratic governments and so on as well. And they have a common interest in trying to run down other institutions, including the media and the legitimate function of the media as the kind of so-called fourth estate and so on as well. So I think that's a problem that both politicians and media shared, and some are trying to do something about it and trying to get more embedded with communities and understand those concerns better. Some perhaps don't care, but there is quite a therefore strong sense of vested, unaccountable interests at work, which causes suspicion, feeds conspiracy theories, and so on as well. So that's one set of issues. And of course, what populist politicians and all of that doubt and kind of conspiracy thinking do is to try to attack and cut away any legitimacy behind what conventional media and conventional journalism does. And combined with the impact of social media, which overall I think is a good thing, and I'll come to the final thought about that in a moment, there's a lot of confusion about what journalism is, how it works, what it does. I think, we'll get on, I'm sure, to talk about the coverage of Israel and Gaza in a moment, but you can see a lot of that confusion at work in the response to the coverage of that at the moment. So, there's a lot of confusion. Some of it is deliberate and malign. Some of it is just because people don't understand how the media work and don't trust it. But that's led to a very complex and difficult context, if you like, for conventional journalism to continue to do what it does. I mean, the other good side about social media, I think, is it is able to hold things to account. It's able to hold politicians to account, and it's able to hold media to account. So just as Jay said, the media is increasingly being called out for some serious errors that it's made in various organizations in various countries over recent years, and that's a healthy thing and a good thing. People have the means of holding it to account. People have means of calling out errors and bias in that way. But the whole social media context is quite a complicated one. I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about it.
Thank you. I have a sort of a related follow-up. And Jay, you discussed specifically objectivity in journalism, but what I'm hearing and what I'm observing is sort of intentional conflation. So we see packaging up, maybe it's 24-hour news, maybe it's clickbait, packaging up of a lot of opinion and a lot of news. And so the readers don't know what's news. They don't know what's opinion. I think this may have even come up in the lawsuits that Fox Corp was dealing with as well, where they'll say, well, this particular actor isn't news. This is a talking piece. So I guess, where do we get to objectivity? How do we get back to objectivity? Is there a way to get back in today's environment where financial incentives are potentially to push more opinion, to get more people to engage? There's also access problems where politician X will only talk to a set of reporters because perhaps they're not going to confront them. Any thoughts on that? I'm going to lead off. I'll let any of you answer that, actually.
Well, opinion has a very bad name in journalism, for the most part. People associate it with subjectivity, which is held to be kind of the opposite of a more desirable objectivity. But if you look at the data, opinion journalism is very much the choice of a lot of news consumers. Very often on my hometown newspaper, the New York Times, the opinion journalism section will be the most read part of the news package repeatedly. And people do still want that distinction between opinion and news. But they are very likely to consume a product that is compounded news, propaganda, opinion, etc. We have a news site that is 1 year old today called Semaphore, which is trying to address this problem in the way that it designs its product. So they have beat reporters that are encouraged to become experts in their beat. And the way they present their work is they start with the news, which they label the news. And that's just the facts that they were able to deliver since the last time they wrote about this subject. And then later down in the story, you'll see them say, and here's David's opinion, where the same reporter that's giving you the unadorned facts is now taking a step further and giving their view of the facts that they just developed, but very clearly labeled. So this is an attempt through news design and transparency to address this complex problem of facts versus opinions. And it recognizes that what's really at stake here is the authority of the journalist. And what they're trying to do is develop journalists who are truly authorities in their beats. And therefore, the news that they dig up is important, but their view of it is also important since they are such experienced observers of their beat. And I think it's these kinds of reforms and revisions in the basic tools of journalism that are called for with the sort of crisis that you just described, which is fully underway.
Can I ask Jay, what's the business model of the website? Can you tell us a bit about that? Because we know it's a big part of the problem today.
Well, we don't exactly know yet because they're new. They raised a lot of money off of the promises that they were giving to with kind of audiences they were going to draw. And so far, they have some advertising, digital advertising, and they have some events. But they're not making money yet, as far as we know. So there's probably still business models that have yet to surface because they're taking it slow, which you have to do. And I'm not saying that they've solved all of our problems or that they're a exciting alternative to everything. Just that. The way that they've designed their product is in reaction to the difficulties that publics have in trusting news these days.
Richard, you're on mute. Richard, we need you on. There you go. Thanks.
Sorry about that. So just to pick up on what Jay said, we can remember, 20 years ago that newspapers had the news section and the comments section, and they were separate and didn't overlap and so on. Now, for various reasons, comment and news have merged. Some of those are commercial reasons, some of them are cultural reasons. And one of the results is people get very confused, I think, between the two. If I think about broadcast, particularly the advent of live broadcasting and, more interviews with correspondents and editors about what's going on, more emphasis on trying to interpret and predict and forecast what's going on. So the line between a professional judgment and a personal opinion has got blurred, and a lot of people sometimes can't tell the difference. Sometimes there isn't a difference. And I think sometimes it leads to overreach where, a journalist who is trying to factually report something is asked a question which encourages them to voice an opinion that they haven't really had time to think through properly and so on as well. So there's a general blurring there of factual reporting and opinion, and it works both ways. Therefore, there's confusion about people think opinion is factual reporting, or they think that factual reporting is opinion. And this has all got kind of tangled up to a large degree. And then, of course, bad actors can come in and exploit that and present, propaganda or disinformation as fact when there's very little behind it. There's no evidence and so on as well. So, one of the things that I talk about and teach and so on is how you separate those and what constitutes factual reporting as against opinion, and how you separate professional judgment for personal opinion, and what are the nuts and bolts of doing that. But I think there is a lot of confusion about that, and therefore it's ripe for exploitation.
Just as a super quick follow-up, I think some of that's intentional, though, because what I see now is the rise of I'm going to create my own news source, news in air quotes, so that I can only get like this truncated messaging out. And we're going to conflate messaging. We're going to create our version of the news and only our version of the news. And then we see some of these politicians gravitating to that side because they're, again, targeting a particularly dissemination channel for a particular audience. So you, as educators in the space, what do you do with the next generation on that issue if objectivity is a core goal?
Well, Jay and I have debated objectivity and impartiality many times over the years. And I think although we have large areas of agreement, we probably also have a slightly different perspective on it. So, in my view, I would say this, having worked for a public broadcaster, if you're publicly funded, impartiality, as we call it in the UK, slightly different from objectivity, which is more talked about in the US. So they kind of overlap a bit. It's crucial because you're publicly funded and you can't exclude a large part of your audience by taking a position. And that's constitutionally what you're expected to do. And the point about that for me is that actually impartiality isn't so much a value or an output, it's a set of professional processes and disciplines that are designed to get you past your personal bias. And therefore, what I do as an educator is to unpack what impartiality means or what objectivity means and break it down into, professional activities. So at a very basic level, it's get both sides of the story and check your facts and allow a right of reply and so on. But you can then work up the tree into more sophisticated approaches to try and get journalism that is impartial or objective. And crucially for me, it's about a focus on evidence and displaying and being transparent about how you got that evidence and where it sits and where to find it. It's about a range and diversity of viewpoints. So evidence, diversity of views, transparency are all the ingredients of that, but you need to break it down into practical activities in order for people to understand how they might achieve that.
I think it's also important to point out that the regime of objectivity and impartiality has suffered some collapses that have really hurt the whole model. And in particular, the one that is most urgent today is that when you have a political system in which one major party is playing by the traditional rules of politics and looks recognizably like a political party that we've had for 50 plus years, and the other party has kind of exited from that system, is generating power in a different way through some of the methods that you're talking about, identifying vulnerability in communities and disinformation. When you have an asymmetry between major parties like that, there is a tendency for news media that is wedded to objectivity or impartiality to distort that picture of that by portraying it as two roughly similar enterprises that are in conflict over their point of view. And so the asymmetry disappears. And I think the difficulty of reacting to an asymmetrical political environment is a huge crisis for impartiality and objectivity. But even to talk about it with our journalists is super hard, because they have so many incentives to ignore that, to re-narrate what I just said.
Yeah, I agree. If I could just come in briefly before I'm sure Ayala's got things to say. I mean, false equivalence is the main criticism of impartiality.
Yes.
But I would say that's not the benchmark for it. That is evidence of it failing. And, if impartiality is done properly and objectivity is done properly, then you don't fall for the false equivalence trap because you've properly weighted the evidence and reflected that in the way that you report. But that is hard work. It takes time. It's often expensive. And that's another reason why we've got a lot of opinion, because opinion is much easier and much cheaper and lots of people like it. So it produces the clicks and produces the revenue. So that's part of the crisis of journalism, I think, is that, we have, and my old employer, the BBC, I worked there for a long time, but some very good people have left to go and sit behind a microphone and opine, because that's a lot easier and now more lucrative than going out in the field and doing the hard work of finding the evidence, properly weighing it up, properly presenting it in a way that produces, value and impartiality and objectivity.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the questions that's been coming up. Oh, sorry, Ayala, please hop in.
No, just to add that I think that one of the important parts here, we talked a lot about the flaws of the media, and there are many more that we haven't yet touched on, but we shouldn't undermine the effect of the public campaign against the media. I'll just mention one study that was conducted in the United States back in 1999. So that's like some 20 years ago. But they were trying to look at the growing perception in the public that the media in the US is liberal, the liberal media. Okay, it was like a thing that really rose. They were trying to understand where it came from. And they did a content analysis of the content of the mainstream media in the United States back then over the course of 20 years, I think. And regardless of what you think about the content itself, if it was initially biased or not, what they saw was that across these 20 years, it didn't shift to the left in any meaningful way. There was no greater liberal bias over time, and yet the public opinion changed significantly, suggesting that the media is suddenly extremely liberal. What does it tell us? That this rhetoric by powerful political figures is very, very consequential. And we can I talked to dozens, if not hundreds, of journalists in the past 5 years during my research, and many of them told me, listen, people hate us, people don't trust us because we weren't objective enough, we weren't biased, we weren't balanced enough, we weren't good enough, we weren't professional enough. And in many cases, that's true. They weren't, and they should do better. But this is not the reason that people are not trusting them. The reason they are not being trusted is that people are constantly telling citizens that they cannot trust journalists, and not just that they cannot trust them, they cannot trust them to be good people or good citizens. It's much bigger than the professional issue. Because when we did a survey with an open question, we asked citizens, what do they think about journalists? What's the qualities of a journalist? And they didn't just come up with terms like bias and fake news and all that. They said they are traitors. They said they are evil, egomaniacs, bloodthirsty. There were terrible texts there. So it's much bigger than this liberal idea of credibility and this rational calculation of who you can trust and who you could trust in the past, and now you can trust them because you know they told you the truth. It's much bigger than that. There is a big hate campaign. It affects journalists' lives and it affects our information. And to Richard's important point about diversity in newsrooms, we know that these campaigns target particularly women and people of color and other religious and ethnic minorities. You can see it all across the board. In different countries, different minorities are suffering more. But we know that one of the strategies that journalists adapt against these brutal attacks is just leaving the profession. We see people either quitting social media or leaving the profession altogether. And so the effort of many years where we like academics and journalists were trying to diversify the newsroom and have more women in the newsroom and more people of color, now you see these people slowly leaving the newsroom, getting inequality even worse than it was. So I think we need to pay a lot of attention to that and to make sure the journalists are stronger and more capable of coping with these orchestrated attacks.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Ellen. Of course, it varies by region around the world. If it's one thing in the UK or the US, it's very different if you're in parts of Eastern Europe, or if you're in parts of the Middle East or Asia, and so on as well. I'll be very interested to see just briefly what happens in Poland, which has just voted in a liberal coalition after years of a populist government. And the populist government had basically taken over the media, almost everything, not quite everything, but almost everything was state controlled, including the public broadcaster. So now you have a more liberal coalition in charge. What are they going to do to try to rebuild media pluralism? And the public broadcaster is going to have to be dismantled and reassembled again, it seems to me. So that's going to be rather an interesting place to watch, to see how you can address some of these issues when the climate shifts.
And just to come back on that, perhaps, Richard, how does the type of issue you've just identified, how did that play into your thinking when you were Director of Global News at the BBC, where you're responsible for such a diverse audience base, and in many cases you're providing the balanced news that's not provided for domestically? How do you think about some of the issues of kind of diversity of viewpoint, and obviously the objectivity question we just addressed as well?
Yeah, just briefly. So the BBC World Service at the time was responsible for 40 different language services, as well as the English language services on radio, TV, and online. So, that was lots of African dialects, 45 different languages, basically. So basically, you had to obviously be sensitive to local and cultural norms and issues and concerns. So we employed journalists from those countries. Therefore, you had some political issues because some of them were dissident and so on, depending on where they come from. So you had to have a very clear set of editorial values and a very clear set of editorial standards and processes and clear editorial oversight about it. Was it always perfect? No, of course not. And often the BBC World Service would get called out, but actually it had a very strong culture of, high quality, unexcitable, some would say even slightly dull tone sometimes, but one that was completely reliable. And as a culture, that was very strong, and the process and systems were pretty good. Didn't work 100%, nothing could, but that very strong sense of standards and strong sense of editorial standards and guidelines and processes to support it, plus localized sensitivity to the issues and the culture that they were broadcasting into, was really what built its reputation over a number of decades.
So I have a question that actually relates to universities as well as journalism. There's this sort of free speech discussion about platforming people. There's certainly many people out there, particularly populists, who actually, I should say many, perhaps across the spectrum, politicians who tend to lie, and we kind of know that they're going to lie. To what degree are we responsible to platform them, and how can we do that? And this gets into some of the discussion around, for example, how CNN handled a town hall recently, and some of the other kind of discussion around, well, I guess there was an argument, how dare you platform this narrative that is going to be false, versus, of course, you need to platform the narrative so people can understand the situation and you have an opportunity. So do you have any perspective on that? Because I know that we are also grappling with these issues at universities.
Well, I have had the same struggle with those questions that other people have had. I did call when Trump was still in office during the pandemic. I argued that no self-respecting network would carry his press conferences live because of the possible danger that he would not just misinform people, but inform them about something dangerous to their health, which he in fact did several times during that period. And it wasn't feasible for news companies to be a conduit for him to disinform people or misinform people on something so important as what to put into your body. And but at the same time, as Trump has gained in power and become the leader of a movement that has overtaken the Republican Party and is clearly on his way to being one of the major candidates for president, I think there's more and more force in the argument that the public has to confront and see this person for who he is. And the only way that you can do that is if you listen to him. And then you have to figure out how to control the spread of disinformation from him, which is what got CNN in trouble in their what they call town hall event with Trump, where they didn't properly anticipate the level of lying and intimidation and the politics of the situation they had set up with Trump supporters in the audience and Trump facing a lone woman journalist who he could typify as a hate object, which is what he did very successfully in that event. And they just went into it with a kind of naivete and a limitation of imagination. They couldn't anticipate what almost anybody in the audience who had paid attention to him over the years could have predicted. And this is part of a bigger failure in the American journalism profession of adjusting to the rise of a demagogue and an authoritarian in one of the two major parties that makes up our political system. There's no set of rules. There's no set of agreed upon practices. There's a kind of absence of imagination, partly because of the influence of both sides and having to keep things fair and equal and 50-50 and down the middle, this entire kind of psychology of symmetry. But even when you are able to predict with vast certainty what he's going to do, the profession of political reporting doesn't always know how to react to that. And I'm not saying that it's easy to do so, but I am saying that if the first step is you have to confront the asymmetry between the two major parties and figure out how you're going to live in a world where you don't have two parties that operate in the same way.
Jay, just briefly out of interest, how much of that was driven commercially? Because obviously the Trump circus brings viewers if you're on TV, and viewers bring advertisers and so on. So
not so much that the event itself was a big money earner. There was a modest increase in ratings for the event. It's more that CNN wanted to be in the action, that they want to be part of the election. They don't want to be left aside. And in fact, to this day, there's an item about it in my Twitter feed today. They're trying to get one of the Republican debates for themselves, and in order to interest the Republican National Committee in CNN as a site for a candidate's debate, they are required to partner with right-wing propagandist sites, essentially, in order to prove somehow that they're open-minded enough to deserve to be one of the sponsors of a Republican debate. When in actuality, because of things we've already talked about today, CNN is probably one of the most important hate objects in the right-wing ecosphere. And it's that form of politics in which you drive a hate movement through the critique and rage at the media. For that kind of politics, CNN is like headquarters.
I agree with Jay. If I can add 2 points to that. So the first one is about the live aspect of it and the live interview. Journalists are in a real conflict there because interviews are important. This is one of the most basic kind of practices of the profession, right? And we do want journalists to hold those in power into account, right? It's important. And even the performance of it is important. It also gives journalists this great feeling of, we are being the watchdog here, right? It is time that we rethink whether interviews with such figures are the best way to report on them. If you think back, we have a vast experience by now in the US and elsewhere. The most important bits of reporting on Donald Trump did not come from interviews with Donald Trump, certainly not live. The investigative reporting, everything we know behind the scenes was so much more important for the public to know. And the value of the interview is sometimes more about the entertainment and the performance rather than what we actually want journalists to do. So I think, and this also goes to Ellen's question about these politicians who now refuse to give interviews to journalists who are real journalists and not propagandists. And the real way to deal with it is not to stop covering them, but to cover them better without the interviews. We don't need those people lying on air. They can lie online. They have their platforms. They will keep spreading lies, disinformation, hate speech. So I think for journalists as well, just getting kind of rid of this mode of thinking that you need the interview, you need this access journalism. You don't. That's not where the Pulitzer is, not today. So that's one thing. And the other thing goes to Richard's point about ratings. And I've heard a lot about ratings from journalists I spoke to, because this is many times the excuse for being lazy. Of course, not you, Richard, or the BBC reporters, but it happens a lot. Journalists go, oh, that's what the public wants. That's what people want. What can you do? That's what they want, right? That's where the ratings is. But this is not really the case, right? If we did only what brings ratings, we would open Newsnight and would see porn, right? That's the best ratings you can get. We do have professional standards. We do have an idea of what should be the news. And in this sense, I think that many journalists, especially journalists under attack in various countries today, need to think not only in the short term, not only about tomorrow's ratings. What we've seen in Israel, for instance, for many years, we saw these far-right figures that are very inflammatory and spreading these lies, hateful lies, and inciting against certain communities. And they got a lot of airtime because it brought ratings, I guess. That's at least the conception in the newsroom. In the long run, this gave these figures so much power, and they got to positions of power they could never dream of, thanks to this exposure and legitimacy that they gained. And then they go after the media. So even in terms of self-preserving news outlets, think long-term. Authoritarianism is not good for journalism. So yeah, you'll have your ratings tomorrow, but then next year they will bring about these new bills about how you can and cannot practice journalism. They will give these regulatory benefits to news outlets that are trying to imitate Fox News or Newsmax or GB News. So I think we should also not give people the kind of not fall for the ratings argument too easily, and remember that journalism has short-term and long-term interests.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, of course, most newsrooms are not strategic. They're tactical and focused on the day and the next deadline. But of course, I suppose their bosses should be strategic. But the point you raise about, as politicians have shifted the ways in which they communicate with the public, perhaps journalism or the media need to adjust the way that they communicate politics. And I think one of the common problems, we've had exactly the same thing in the UK in terms of right-wing figures being built by the media and then turning on it. But I think, there's an obsession with process over policy. There's an obsession with what's loudest and most colourful over what's strategic or what's perhaps most significant. And that's really about a shift in news values, which in a hyper-competitive environment is quite difficult because the pack runs together. But I think it's a really important point to say, actually, there is perhaps an opportunity now for someone to build a reputation by differentiating their journalism and coming at it in a very different way from the rest of the pack.
Yes, let me add one thing to what Richard just said. It's hard sometimes to realize this, but the news system we have is not designed for human understanding. It's designed to produce new content every day. And until we go back to what are we trying to accomplish here and start looking at the system as a whole, it will continue on its present route where it's designed to produce content and also to beat the other guy to the story. It is not actually designed to provide a human way of understanding what's going on in the world. And you see this in the what's called the you see it with the lack of match between background that allows you to understand the story and the updates that are today's news. And incrementalism in journalism, where the reporters are interested in what's new today, but they don't necessarily know if the broader public even understands the significance of these micro dots in the story. That's that's the kind of design problem that I mean, where nobody actually wanted it to be that way, designed it to be that way. That's just the way the news system works. It's never been designed for human understanding.
Well, of course, public service media was designed to try and increase public understanding, but it gets drawn along with the pack, and it wants to be competitive.
Yes.
It wants to have an audience, so it gets pulled, along with everybody else. That's one of the problems.
That's what I meant.
Someone's just asked a question about non-commercial, non-profit journalism, and I chair a non-profit, and I think does have an important role to play. But the fact is, there are some very good non-profits, particularly in the States, where there's a strong culture of philanthropy. The philanthropic environment in the UK is not as good as that, though it's better than some other places, and similarly in Europe. But my worry is whether non-profits outside perhaps of the US can ever be sustainable. But they do have exactly that role. They are, if you like, freed up to drift away from the pack and try to find, some journalism and some activity that does add to public understanding, because they don't have the same commercial pressures.
Mm-hmm.
Just to go off that, I think it might be worth raising the devil's advocate position to some of the things that have just been said, particularly as it relates to platforming perhaps controversial or divisive political figures. I mean, the devil's advocate position is that authoritarians or people who are perceived to have authoritarian tendencies don't like questioning or indeed comedy or anything that might reveal conflicts in their arguments. Also say that there's the position that you don't platform who you like, you don't platform who's ethical, you platform who's relevant, and that the role of the journalist should be to platform who's relevant, and to question them and to use the sort of questioning method to get to the bottom of what they think. And that there's roles certainly for investigation and analysis outside of that, but to not interview the primary source would maybe be neglectful of some salient information for the public. So how would you kind of rebut those points, maybe? And then finally, I just want to bring in people in the comments have been asking quite a bit about communities who feel kind of left out of the news cycle, feel like their issues aren't prioritized, or feel like the news it really isn't relevant to them, and that being the source of some of the pushback against journalists. Do you think part of that is because there is a reluctance to cover political figures who might be controversial but are also well liked? And how do you view your role in responsibly treating those issues?
So to the question of the platforming, that's a great question. It is a conflict of we have different interests here, right? We do want to journalists to have interviews, but it doesn't mean that they have to be aired live. It doesn't mean that they necessarily have public value. If they do, air them. If they don't. It should be a source like any other source, but a source that lied to you before. So it should be taken perhaps more suspiciously. So I should definitely think it should remain in the toolkit of journalists, but perhaps not be the golden standard as is. And particularly the journalists shouldn't fear losing access and doing all kinds of compromises when reporting in order not to lose their access to these politicians. That's extremely important. Otherwise, you give them immense power over your reporting. And especially when you have figures like Trump, like Netanyahu in Israel and many others in other countries, if you give this type of politician your go on air whenever they feel like it, then they become your editor-in-chief, I would say. They are editing the news now. So the fact that journalists are being accused of censorship when not airing these speeches live or rallies or whatever doesn't mean that it is censorship. It's using your editorial power to make sure people get the knowledge they need. So I think this is difficult to resist, but journalists must get better at it because we see how harmful it is. And this gets again to the communities as well, because yes, there are communities that we talked a lot about how they were being left behind in these past few years since Brexit and Trump's victory. But there are many communities that were in many ways left behind, and we are not talking about all of them. We are talking about the ones that are being cuddled by this populist campaign. Oftentimes, we saw a lot of attempts at correcting the US media ignoring Trump supporters, or the UK media ignoring Brexit supporters. But there are many other disenfranchised communities, both in the UK, in the US, certainly in other countries. And since we don't have this orchestrated campaign about how that causes them this resentment and hostility towards the media, we don't see the corrections as much. And I think this is a big part of diversifying our media environment and paying attention to all communities that were overlooked over the years and are not being represented.
Yeah, I think we're still in the infancy of learning how to deal with this platform or don't platform question. And we only know a little bit about what could improve the situation. One small method that makes sense is what's sometimes called the truth sandwich approach, where when you have to, because it's important, give news coverage to something that's inflammatory, demagogic, or just plain false, but important, you try to use the truth sandwich, where you introduce something that's true, you put the dubious statement in the middle, then you reinforce what's true, so that neither the first nor the last impression that the user gets will be of a lie. So that is one answer to platform or not platform. Another answer is simply to create a category of bad actors who have, as you said, perhaps lied to you before, so that you simply know that this is a problematic person to interview, and you can go into an exchange with special preparation that might be required given the bad actor that you are interviewing. So to be prepared, I think, is really important. Also, another small discovery we've made is to ask the question, would this person be saying any of this or doing these things if there were no media coverage? And if they wouldn't do this if there were no media coverage, that's a good reason not to cover it. So it's through the discovery of small practices like this that make sense, rather than vast generalizations like platform or don't pre-platform. I think our progress is going to be made in slow steps with smart practices that we can adapt to different kinds of settings. But this is one of the hardest problems in disinformation and news coverage.
If I may follow up, and I recognize we're hitting the hour, so hopefully we can extend a little bit. We're working under this assumption that we can identify truth, but recent events indicate there's a fog of war in many of these contexts, and it's not yet clear what truth really is, nor how much evidence one would need to get to the truth. And then there's perceptions. One of the audience members notes, for example, there's perceptions on how the media is currently covering the situation in the absence of the evidence, or with early sourcing, if you will, around the evidence. So in that situation, how do you come in? So if you're reporting in a war example, or if you're reporting where we're still not yet clear what truth really is, thoughts on how to approach it in that way? And because Jay, you'd mentioned like the truth sandwich, but that doesn't necessarily work in that context. And the last 2 days are very clear evidence.
Sure. Let me try a couple of things briefly. Yeah. I'm sure Ayala will have some good views on this. Obviously, one of the big problems I think is the 7/24 always on news cycle, where everything has to be live. Everything, speed is of the essence. Being first is of the essence, and particularly when there's a kind of fevered atmosphere around something like the appalling attack that we saw 10 days ago, people want answers immediately. And of course, truth takes a long time to emerge sometimes. So one of the things that I observed, I'll be interested in other people's view of it, is that what would be conventional news gathering practices are not recognized or accepted. So when an event happens and, a conventional news gathering practice is to find spokespeople and see what they say about it, and find other kind of authorities and ask them what information they have and so on as well. And in the always on 24/7 environment, reporters tweet that. It's the first quote they get, they tweet it, and then they move on to make the rest of their calls to try and build up a picture of what's going on. But, social media takes the first thing they say, ignores the attribution to the spokesman, and just says this organization has, affiliated with this viewpoint. When it hasn't. All it's done is to make the very first of perhaps dozens of inquiries in order to try and build up a very complicated picture. And the truth, the final settled view, is going to take hours, if not days, or sometimes weeks to emerge. But the expectation is it's going to have been settled and emerged in the very first post that anybody makes. Now, that is simply, an unrealistic expectation. You could say, well, then we need to help people understand all the rest of it. It's a very difficult thing to get around, but I think perhaps news organizations need to explain their work more carefully. So it's easy to say, we should all be transparent about processes. It's quite difficult in a tweet or in a quick live two-way update or whatever. But they need to signal, look, this is the first of many, many calls. This is only a partial view. We're still working out to fill out the rest of what's happening. They need to be much more explicit about the process of news gathering so people can understand what's going on. Because actually news organizations tend to work in shorthand. You see online, sources, claims just put in inverted commas because journalists understand that means it's, an attributed view, not one that the organization subscribes to. But perhaps many, many of the readers don't understand that shorthand. So I think news organizations have got to think about ways of being much more explicit and signaling much more clearly the process that's going on, because a lot of people don't understand it. And there are a lot of people who want to assume the worst, and there are bad actors who want to exploit that. And we've certainly seen a lot of that over the last few days.
I'd be interested in what Ayala says to that. But one simple way of doing that, incredibly easy, is to start with what we know and what we don't know, and to make that a habit. And it's incredibly simple. It doesn't cost anything. It's 10, 12 words, but it could begin to address the very real problem you're laying out for us, Richard.
100%. And I think what we saw in the past few days, and specifically with the horrendous attack on the hospital in Gaza, is that certain news outlets made some statements and then kind of retracted them and started doing precisely that. If you go into the New York Times now or other big news outlets, and we need to recognize that there are very few news outlets globally who can actually do such an investigation nowadays, and verify those facts, just because of resources, because they don't have journalists on the ground, because they don't have the money, the budget, the resources. So, but you do see now a few news outlets trying to do exactly that and explain what they do. And the reason I love it when journalists explain what they do is that first it's educating the people, because people today don't necessarily know a lot about how journalism actually works, right? They think that it works the way their Facebook feed works. They just write something and people respond to this, right? So I think it's educating, and also it makes journalists more aware of their process, because when you do explain to your readers the process, you cannot write, oh, I asked the spokesperson for the Tories and for the Labour, and then I just put it out here, right? It also makes you more critical of your own work, and you have to self-reflect, and you have to make sure that you are following the process that you would want people to know that you went through for them. So I think it's a great idea. It will have to become a norm. We know that there is another problem in newsrooms today, that are not enough. There are not always experts on the new technologies that allow you to verify facts of this sort. So this is another field that will have to change significantly. We know that many of the most senior reporters and journalists grew up and were trained in a different era. They're not necessarily the people who can use the best, newest technologies and tools to make sure that this visual and this kind of technology and big data work together, right? It's a whole other bit that journalists weren't trained, and still, to my knowledge, in most journalism schools are not trained to do. There is a whole world of technology that needs to be embraced and better understood inside newsroom in terms of verification, especially when we talk about international news, but also when it comes to a lot of content that kind of pops up in social media, and then journalists start chasing its source.
I think, I mean, you've touched upon emerging issues in journalism, and perhaps hinted at kind of a generational element, but also a qualification element surrounding things like the use of big data and things that require specialist training. It seems like two really important topical issues facing journalists, particularly as it pertains to the topic of democratic backsliding, would be the ascent of generative AI, particularly deep fakes, which are really credible. And also, of course, we've come into a greater awareness in recent years of foreign authoritarian disinformation that's been propagated within consolidated democracies, and the speculation that that has or could shape democratic outcomes. How qualified do you feel journalists are to attribute things like foreign disinformation, given that that's just analytically a very difficult thing to do? And how concerned are you about journalism as a profession's ability to grasp the benefits of technologies like AI while mitigating the obvious potential downside of technologies, particularly when they're widely available globally?
Well, I'm fairly confident that the major news organizations can avoid, for example, allowing AI to write their news for them. I think there's a lot of skepticism within these companies about taking that kind of step. There's a lot of self-criticism and critical thinking within these organizations about how to avoid letting the machines sort of take over the crafting of news. And there's a recognition, which I think is the right path, that these technologies can't be ignored. They could offer important power to good newsrooms if they're used to gather information and not to replace the journalists themselves. So I think we're okay so far with newsrooms receiving these technologies in the right way. Training newsrooms and people who've been doing their work in one way for a long time to begin taking some of the responsibility of detecting bad information when it floods the system, that's a much bigger challenge in my point of view. And I don't think we've really started to address that yet.
Yeah, I agree with Jane. I think the big news organizations will probably be fine. They'll work their way through it. I think your newsrooms need to start thinking about the frameworks within which they will use AI, and there's quite a lot of thinking going on both in news organizations and in academia and so on to try and develop those. So I'm reasonably optimistic that side of it will work out. But of course, those technologies are available to bad actors as well. There's a number of kind of research studies coming out now that are actually saying, the risk of AI feeding a great tsunami of misinformation is overstated. AI is just a tool. It's only about the people. But I think that overlooks the fact that what the technology allows is, disinformation at scale in a way that we haven't experienced before. So I would not underestimate that necessarily. But in terms of the kind of training to identify foreign actors and so on as well, I mean, again, that is a specialist skill. Now, I think journalism schools and so on are stepping up to that, but also the news organizations themselves need to step up to that training, just as they're beginning to, or the best ones have already established open source investigative teams, and I think they will, be able to use some of that skill and some of the computational journalistic skills to be able to identify, states that are trying to run influence operations around elections or whatever it may be. So the skills are there; they're not widespread enough, but people are recognized that training needs to happen, and in key places it is starting to happen quite well.
So I'm very conscious of time, so I was hoping we could wrap up with one final question, and that is, in the context of democratic backsliding, who is actually doing great work, and more importantly, what kind of practice are they employing in doing it? Do you have any examples? I actually expected an answer.
Disappointing pause there, isn't it?
Wow.
So I suppose, and let me just kick off and allow the others to think about it. I mean, if you're really asking what sources do I trust and why, which is another way of perhaps thinking about that question, then, personally, it's organizations who I know have values and have standards that I appreciate and who are to some degree accountable. So you're asking what my particular consumption habits. It tends to be BBC Radio in particular, the FT, perhaps the New York Times, and a lot of specialist sites from people that I have learned to trust and know that they have got specialist expertise. And, the availability of that, thanks to social media and Substack and all the rest of it, is now greater than ever. So you curate your own range of experts that you trust, and then you find 2 or 3, mainstream media sources whose values and whose standards, you can rely upon.
Trustingnews.org. Trustingnews.org is doing some interesting work in this area, and I invite people to check them out.
I would recommend, especially these days, Haaretz newspaper, not because I was working there many, many years ago, but because it's one of the only reliable sources for news from Israel and Palestine. I'm sure many people now are curious about what's going on there. So I would definitely recommend them. I think that Mehdi Hassan is doing great work in the US on this issue and others. And I think that journalists who are struggling now, but are also sharing with their audiences their dilemmas and explaining why they do what they do, is another good way to detect someone you can trust.
Thank you. I would add, although I'm the least qualified here to add, I'm very interested in the rise of open source intelligence, and particularly Bellingcat's work. Mm-hmm. And I think we're starting to see more of that being introduced, particularly in the context of some of the situations we've recently seen to try to geolocate, et cetera. So I would throw Bellingcat in the mix as well. I really genuinely appreciate each of you showing up today to participate with this. What I find interesting in this context is that each one of our panelists is on X/Twitter, whatever we call it these days. So you can find them there. And I suppose at some point we could give the handles out. But in any case, I really genuinely appreciate your time. Thank you, Charlotte, for joining to help facilitate this discussion. Thank you, everybody who joined us. And hopefully we can continue this conversation later. I think we barely scratched the surface on this, but I do think that anybody who is willing to do diligent work and kind of identify and provide evidence that's more aligned with this notion of truth, or that at least tries to counterweight and communicate around what we think is happening with clarity around the procedure by which they evaluated that evidence, I think is really, really critical in today's society globally. So I really appreciate the time. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And I look forward to seeing you at future webinars.